Welcome back to the show that tells you you are a quantum computer with free will, pinched off from a unified field of consciousness. My name is Justin Riddle, and this is episode 32 of the Quantum Consciousness series. In today's episode, I'll be presenting an interview I conducted with Andres Gomez-Emilsson, the Director of Research at the Qualia Research Institute. This interview took place on November 4th, 2022 in Oakland, California. In this interview, we'll be talking about various ideas about consciousness from Andres, such as mathematical fictionalism, symmetry of valence theory, neural annealing as it pertains to psychedelic therapy for psychiatric illness, and an overall model of consciousness presented by Andres that relies heavily on geometry. I will be interrupting the interview periodically in this episode to summarize a lot of these ideas and to provide some graphical representations which will hopefully make the material more accessible. If you like what you hear today, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment below, or for the audio listener, write a review. And without further ado, we'll hop into the interview.
Join me deep inside the mystery of numbers. Come and have a metaphysical view. See how concepts become objects and then become qualia. Join us for an episode of Quantum Consciousness.
Okay, hey Andres, great to be here with you. We're just here to check in, talk about some consciousness questions.
Fantastic.
Yeah, let's do it. So just to start off, why don't you introduce yourself, introduce the Qualia Research Institute?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here. I've been enjoying your videos. It's really fun talking to a quantum consciousness person who's not crazy. And
well, I hope not, yeah.
Certified not crazy.
Certified.
So the Qualia Research Institute, me and Mike Johnson co-founded it around 2016. And essentially, we have a theory of consciousness, which is, something kind of crazy to say, but okay, everybody has a theory of consciousness.
We all have one. Yes, exactly.
Whether we realize it or not, right?
Yeah.
It's implicit at the very least. At the very least, people have theories of mind and a story they might tell themselves about what's going on. But we have a very, very, systematic theory that tackles what we think is kind of every area of concern, essentially breaking down the hard problem of consciousness into tractable sub-problems. And essentially, we started with that. And a very important influence as well is the philosopher David Pearce.
Okay.
Do you know him?
I feel like I don't know him too well. I know the name, but
okay.
Maybe a brief intro.
Yeah. David Pearce is a transhumanist philosopher from the UK. So essentially, he advocates for the reduction and ultimately the elimination of suffering. Extremely ambitious task.
Noble goal.
Yeah, somewhat controversial in some circles, but essentially, he's also he has kind of a theory of consciousness as well, very very synergistic with QRI's perspective, and essentially QRI is kind of this blend of there's a way of breaking down the hard problem of consciousness, and there's the goal of getting rid of suffering. In some sense, it's kind of the meaning of life. It's kind of have fun and understand, but also take care of each other. It would be maybe one way of summarizing it.
Yeah.
Essentially, we think there's actually some people might say it's a suspicious convergence of your intellectual interest and ethical imperative, they come together. But essentially, I think so. I mean, we actually have a good theory of consciousness that will allow us to create better neuroscience, and in turn that allows us to make better neurotechnology that can cash out in ways to prevent massive amounts of suffering throughout the world.
Yeah, there's this idea that, philosophy of mind is a luxury science,
right.
Or it's just kind of a fun pastime. But yeah, I agree. I think it is really core, how we view ourselves, how we identify.
Yeah.
It really informs everything around us. And learning more about the nature of self, the nature of mind, should be at the forefront of maybe medicine and technology, right? It seems like that should be the future, at least to my mind.
Yep. So a quick rundown of, I guess, the very high level picture of QRI.
Yeah.
So 3 disciplines and 3 goals, and then there's the mission in our website, which is how like kind of these get condensed, how it cashes out. So the disciplines are like straight up philosophy of mind, like publishing papers in academia about like actual philosophy of mind, tackling, classic questions like the binding problem or the hard problem of consciousness or the causal efficacy of consciousness, the palette problem in Qualia. All of that stuff.
That one, but okay.
In brief, it's, like what's up with the variety of like Qualia values and textures that exist, like, and what are their interrelationships and why are they the way they are? Like that's very puzzling, right? Why is there like color qualia and audio qualia and tactile qualia? Yeah. How are they connected to each other?
Yeah, how do they connect? Yeah, how do you go across multiple modalities? Is that kind of the core question there?
Yeah. So that would be the other, the palette problem. It also cashes out in essentially one of the components, which is like mapping out the state space of consciousness. One of the elements of mapping out the state space of consciousness is identifying all of the Qualia values that are possible. Where like, okay, this very particular shade of blue would be a very specific Qualia value, but then like this particular, timbre of sound would be another one. And then like how they, come together, how can they aggregate? So yeah, straight up philosophy of mind. The second discipline is neuroscience.
Nice.
We live by the ideology, maybe misguided. No, actually it's very generative, which is like, if you have like better philosophy of mind, that should cash out into like innovative ways of doing neuroscience, kind of like new perspectives on neuroscience.
Yeah, new perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was gonna say, we definitely need new models. I think, one epiphany I had was just the simplicity of these cause-effect models that just run rampant in biology. Like protein A causes protein B, and that causes protein C, and it's just such a real simple linear way of thinking, and that is just such the default, And I think there's so much room to, I don't know, have a geometric influence or have, who knows, just like other forms of causality that aren't just so like locally based and like simply based. Yeah. I don't know what that would look like, but
I'd be happy.
Maybe you would have an idea.
Maybe some ideas. And then the third discipline is neurotechnology. It's like actually, cashing out the neuroscience to construct the high-level logic for neurotechnological interventions. And I mean, the latest kind of like fun thing in that space, if you look at our the QRI YouTube channel, we have like some research on like, exploring the state space of like haptic stimulation and how there's like a lot of body vibrations are like really euphoric and healing. Others are like actually kind of like anxiogenic and unpleasant and weird.
Gotcha.
And like, we kind of like developed a music theory for body vibrations.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, I love this idea that there is like some real feedback you get from people's experience, and it's sure it's a verbal report, but you can understand what they're saying, and then you can really map these like subjective spaces that you can't really measure except through like verbalization, right? But then if you get enough reproducibility across people's experiences, like how is that not scientific? You know
Absolutely.
What I mean?
Yep.
Yeah. If it's reproducible, it's scientific, I guess.
Yes.
Like fundamentally.
No, and there's an enormous variability in people's kind of introspection quotient or something like that. We're like, well, it's one of the the things that we claim. A lot of the things that we've discovered actually come from like people who are like just kind of extreme outliers in like introspection quotient or something like that.
Like their ability to introspect, or like the accuracy of their introspection, or
both, and also kind of like the breadth of metaphors they might use, for example.
Okay.
And their ability to like precisely quantify aspects of their experience. Like for example, there's like some advanced meditators with whom we have collaborated. That like, I mean, I kid you not, if you like shine a stroboscopic light at them, they can tell you, oh, this is probably 17 hertz.
Wow.
Like that level of accuracy. And it's like, okay, maybe it wasn't 17, but it was like 16. And it's like, plus minus 2. And he's like, how do you do that? But like, if they can do it with stroboscopic stimulation where the ground truth, okay, this is the strobing effect. And then they say like, well, I entered into, third jhana mixed with, this like equanimity factor, and it was like strobing at like 12 hertz. He's like, okay, I believe you. And like, we can use that data. So it's, that kind of like super advanced kind of introspection abilities. We call it the Shulgin quotient.
Oh, nice.
in honor of Sasha Shulgin, writer of Pikal. So yeah, very, very happy to dive deeper into that. But yeah, and then we also have the 3 objectives, which is kind of like the ethically serious component of QRI, which is getting rid of intense suffering. We think like that's kind of like an ethical priority. We make a lot of arguments that like kind of like a lot of like lenses for cost prioritization within effective altruism essentially neglect the actual hedonic quality of experience. For example, you have this measure that is called quality adjusted life years. Maybe a little bit better than just like, okay, number of years like saved or something like that.
But yeah, so how much of the time of your life did you enjoy, or did you have a meaningful experience?
Exactly. So if you use that as kind of your objective function for evaluating interventions, I think like it's a really great, first step. But the problem is that quality adjusted life years is kind of ignorant of the actual distribution of hedonic states. So the difference between somebody who's kind of like, not enjoying life and is kind of like depressed versus somebody who's like having like cluster headaches every day looks the same from the point of view of quality adjusted life years. And so like you're actually kind of like there's a ton of suffering that is completely invisible from that lens. And instead we're championing a completely different perspective, which is it cashes out into kind of this notion of like hedons per second. Actually how many like micro experiential moments of suffering are you having?
Oh my god.
And trying to minimize that, which is like if you look at it from that perspective, all of a sudden, okay, actually getting rid of cluster headaches, like get rid of like 10% of the world's suffering, like something like absolutely insane, which is like this like very simple cheap intervention that from a different lens may look like you did nothing, right? So and I'm not saying like let's only use this lens. I'm saying like it's an important one that is like completely neglected, and QRI is kind of like championing that perspective.
Gotcha. One thing I've thought about with like hedonism, right, how do we quantify, I guess, what's fulfilling? And I feel like when you just go so far into like pleasure principle, it feels like almost too reductive. And I'm not accusing you of being overly reductive, but I feel like there's got to be some element of like meaning or fulfillment or like interconnectedness or like, right? Like does part of the hedonism relate to to a more abstract concept? Or
somebody described QRI, and I think me in particular, as like a boss level hedonist. So like,
okay,
so
nice.
like I'm actually like a hardcore like hedonistic, utilitarian. There's like a lot of like open questions.
Yeah.
But I mean I claim that I can answer any of those concerns. One element is that and if you talk to like Buddhists who have looked at this very carefully, and also like if you introspect on yourself, meaning itself, the reason we value it is because it has positive valence. And it like organizes the structure of your mind in such a way that you experience many more micro experiential moments of well-being. Now, pleasure has a connotation that sounds selfish and self-centered, and it's absolutely the case that there's like a lot of varieties of pleasure that are like that, especially very dopaminergic driven, addictive behaviors. Like when I say like optimizing,
I think we all know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Whereas from our lens, if you're having kind of a experience of cosmic unity and complete well-being and union with God, that from our point of view, it's a very what we call high valence experience. Like
but it kind of feels less selfish, right? Is what you're saying. But then
totally not it's totally not selfish.
Is it really?
Like it has a representational content that, for example, has like expanded moral circle of compassion, which I think is like absolutely valuable and extremely instrumentally useful. But when it comes down to it, the moment-to-moment value of those experiences, independent of their like outward positive effects, which also can be in principle quantified, is that it's actually a profound feelings of well-being. And one of the overarching kind of like frameworks that we have at QRI is what we call valence structuralism. This is the idea that the thing that determines whether an experience feels good or bad is the actual structure of the experience. So essentially every moment of experience maps onto these like mathematical object, and is the structure of the mathematical object that determines whether you're feeling good or bad.
Yeah.
And yes, like sure, like the moment you're coming up on cocaine and like you feel a bit kind of like clear-headed and expanded and motivated, has some elements, like it has some facets that essentially have like these very positive kind of like smooth consonant aspects of experience that are like positive valence. If you're having a mystical experience on a Zen retreat or on 5-MeO DMT or whatever it may be, also has those elements, but maybe like 1,000 times like more energized and much more comprehensive. It's not just kind of like this like gloss over your experience. It's kind of like all of your experience is like that. And so, and you know, people actually might describe these like, you know, they might have like a profound 5-MeO DMT experience. They come down and say like, oh my gosh, that was kind of like the essence of what falling in love was trying to get at, and what like eating chocolate was trying to get at, and what like cocaine was trying to get at. But all of those,
he never quite reached to that like pristine structure.
Exactly. All of those were like very imperfect slices or projections of the actual thing, which is, you know, in a very poetic sense, is kind of a God in a state of perfect well-being. And like that is, you know, there's a way of describing that which is like hedonistic, but again, without the connotation of selfishness.
Yeah, interesting. Oh my God, yeah, so many things we could spin off with this one, but to kind of like dive into a little bit of a Platonist question for you.
Yeah, well,
or do you want to not derail?
No, I just wanted to say like the last two.
The last two elements, yeah.
Which is improving baseline, and we can probably get into these when we get into anti-tolerance drugs.
Sure. Okay.
Probably one of the most like, kind of like Caesar controversial aspects of QRI, which is actually kind of fun. And then the last one is achieving new heights, which essentially is like, how do we make it possible for people to have like healthy, wholesome, aligned experiences of super bliss, essentially. Want to enable, ideally everybody will have the right in the future to have something like a positive, guaranteed positive 5-MeO DMT experience. Like that's, for me, that would be like, okay, like that's definitely a part of
amazing.
Utopia.
So you would figure out all the facets or factors of what shapes a person's experience, and then you can just like neutralize the negative ones and like reach a point of like high probability guaranteed, or
or maybe guaranteed.
Maybe even guaranteed.
Maybe it's a question of how many nines.
How many nines of perfect experience? Yeah.
But yeah, Platonism, happy to dive into that.
Oh, yeah, well, just going to comment, like, you were talking about these different structures and, like, the commonality between experiences. And so, like, when I hear about Qualia research, I'm kind of imagining, like, can we map out Qualia space? Is there a domain that we're mapping out? And then, to me, that feels like the Platonist dream, right? Sure. That there's sort of this, like, transcendental shared reality or some shared structure behind each of us, and then when I learned about my experience, I learned about your experience just by virtue of there being a universal structure that we're tapping into. So I don't know, how do you engage with those concepts? 'Cause I know you have a recent video kind of like swinging against Platonism, but maybe I could just try to understand your argument. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, I think the title was something like Mathematics as the Study of Patterns of Qualia.
Yeah.
From psychotic Platonism to enlightened fictionalism. So, I mean, my theory of mathematics is fictionalism. I do think that it isn't the case that there is a transcendental world made of pure math. I think that's a fiction. It's a very useful fiction because it allows you to get into like a mathematical cognitive style that is very generative.
Yeah.
When it comes down to it, like the ontological status of the mathematical Platonic world is like the same as the ontological status of the Lord of the Rings. It's a really neat story. But here's the thing, like, just to give you a hint of what I'm trying to get at, and like, if you study a triangle, if you're thinking about a triangle, you're seeing a triangle, you're seeing the corners and so on, you get this impression that you're kind of like studying a mind-independent object and seeing different facets of it.
Yeah, it seems like that,
But it seems like it, right?
Yeah.
But analyze this from the point of view of, let's say, like a really hardcore, like, insight practice, like Zen monk who spent like 20 years like being able to dissect his experience, like or her experience, like super finely. You actually don't experience a triangle. what you experience is like very brief flashes of fixation points of attention enveloped in a field of awareness that is sensing different facets of this construct. And at some point you can experience like some flashes of a gestalt, but even the flashes of a gestalt are component of like microfixation points. And so at no point actually the triangle exists. The thing that exists is a much weirder thing, which is this kind of like blanket of awareness that is segmenting itself out and getting these like pinch points and elements that create the illusion of a person seeing a triangle. But the triangle itself doesn't exist.
So we never hold like the actual model of a triangle holistically in our minds.
So
is
like
what you're saying.
Even when
Maybe in awareness, but not in attention.
in a way, well, you can you can have like what we call like large attention pads. Like if you take 5-MeO DMT at a small dose, you experience sometimes like gestalts all at once. You do get kind of like this like, oh, this triangle appears all at once. But even when you're seeing the triangle all at once, actually the thing that is going on is that there is this field of awareness that is focusing on this like structure and in some sense sending waves of energy towards it that then get reflected back into the field of awareness. And the actual shape of the experience is like this complicated...
It's like this whole thing, looking at the thing.
Yeah. Is not...
And you can't separate those, is what you're saying.
No, they're they co-arise.
All right, so over the course of this interview, I'm really starting to build an understanding of Andres' full model. And so I think as we go through this interview together, I now have the 2020 hindsight to kind of understand and grasp his overall model. And I'm going to try to lay out portions of this, and it'll kind of get more and more clear as we go on. And so for me, when I think about geometry, and this is covered heavily in the previous episode 31, I really view geometry as something of a shared language that we can have between individuals, right? I can picture a triangle and you can picture a triangle, and we can rest assured that if we agree upon sort of the space of what we're talking about, that we're both talking about the same thing. And so what I'm kind of struggling with in this part of the interview, when I'm trying to grapple with, is this idea that you can have a geometric theory of consciousness which is not Platonic. It doesn't have that universality to it. And so what Andres is essentially trying to pitch here is this idea that there's this unified field of consciousness, and there's sort of this pinched off, segmented off chunk of that field, which is you. And then within that field of awareness, which is you, there can be sort of bifurcations, as he calls them, or distortions in that field, which then are the information content within your field of consciousness. So that field of awareness, that field of consciousness, and then you can have your attention placed on a certain pattern, a geometric distortion really within that field. And so that can take the form of a triangle. And so you're thinking about a triangle within that field, but as Andres is trying to suggest, it's incorrect to sort of view the triangle independently from the observer observing the triangle, because the triangle is a distortion within this larger geometric space, this larger field of awareness. And, he taps into some temporal domains. Also, there's these vibrations going on. So it's not just a spatially constructed geometry, but it's a temporally vibrating, moving sort of field, I think is how I'm imagining his model. And so there's sort of a distinction made here between the contents of awareness and the awareness itself, which is kind of what I'm getting at when I said attention versus awareness. There's sort of a shape being represented, and then there's the awareness itself. And maybe there's certain qualities to that space. And so I'm trying to push Andres, I think, to think about, these symmetries, these different patterns, if there's a regularity to those patterns that has some sort of universal shared meaning, right? When we're talking about pleasure and hedonism, trying to get everyone's sphere of awareness to experience pleasure, for example, some sort of altruistic drive to achieve a reduction of suffering in the world around us, is there something universal to the reduction of suffering in that there is some symmetry, some sort of resonant, coherent pattern? So maybe Andres would agree with me that we don't want to ascribe universality to a triangle, but maybe there's some more meta patterns which are universal or are kind of describing the universe itself. And if this is getting very abstract, I've touched on this a number of times in the series. Really, just when we think about the universe itself versus the laws or the rules governing the universe, are we conflating these two things together, right? Your sphere of awareness, my sphere of awareness, my mind, your mind, and then the mathematics, the rules, the geometric principles that guide each of these different minds. Is there something common to those rules, to those laws? And I would suggest that having laws of physics is an inherently Platonic idea. To have something shared, to have something universal, to have something that's so meta that ontologically there are rules to the universe, and we often don't consider that part of the universe. And a lot of the Roger Penrose model that I've been discussing in this series, the three-world model, it takes explicitly the idea that we need to have a mathematics, right? That mathematics is a part of our model of the universe, and it is in some ways distinct from the instantiation of you and me. I'm here, you're there, we both have our own physical brains, but we could have a shared rules governing our different experiences. And so what gets tricky here is Andres is really pitching this idea of fictionalism, where the mathematics that you create and that I create are fictions and stories that we're telling ourselves. And so we're sort of in a pure qualia realm, where qualia is the feeling, the subjectivity of our experience. And Andres really puts subjectivity and qualia at the sort of pinnacle of ontology, of a metaphysics of reality, is that subjectivity, understanding subjectivity in the domain of subjectivity, is what we need to be describing. And so mathematics is within the domain of subjectivity, right? Mathematics is the ordering, the sequencing of information that we apply to the information that we're processing, but we shouldn't confuse our understandings of the world with the world itself, because qualia is fundamental, experience is fundamental. And yeah, I can resonate with these ideas. I guess I just question, well, then if there's any sort of regularity to the qualia, to that unified field of consciousness, isn't that regularity some sort of Platonic truth or some sort of mathematics or some sort of, regularity that goes beyond any particular instantiation? So more on this, and we'll check back in after a little bit more.
When you are like in deep meditative absorption into a particular shape, I mean, I joke, I've been into these like streak recently of like sacred geometry, because sacred geometry is like the ultimate kind of like crackpot, honey trap or something.
Because it's like indefensible, but we all kind of like resonate with it somehow, and so we're like drawn into into agreeing with it on some level, and then it's like, well, and I kind of mentioned in my last video, like, where do you go from there? Okay, I have this like this shape, and a bunch of people see it in its altered states.
So here's the thing.
Okay, what do you do?
So exactly, I mean, it's like a metaphor I was thinking of is like a teenager atheist, right? Is like you can have a strong emotional reaction against, let's say, like preachy Christianity, because you feel that they're like using appeal to emotions to like break your rational capacities, and like they're getting you from underneath or something like that. I think yeah, like the typical kind of rationalist, you know, og field reaction to like sacred geometry is like yeah, sure, if you get into those patterns you'll have like trippy experiences, but like that doesn't, you know, people then come out with like a whole metaphysics of like, oh yeah, the connecting, you know, energy spots that connect you to the universal mind, to have like all kind of like crazy metaphysics. And in some sense, yes, it's kind of an emotional manipulation where or think of it this way, like Alexander Shulgin reported he was once invited to like a retreat in Brazil, where supposedly it was like a drug-free experience, where essentially they would give you this sacrament, and you know, it's kind of like, well, with prayer, you know, you're charged up this water.
It's like a placebo.
It's supposedly a placebo,
Yeah.
and people take it, and it's like wow, I felt the same love I had like the moment I married my wife. Like it just, you know, the rapture of, they felt connected to God, and it was perfect. And yeah, they did, you know, somebody snicked out a tiny sample of it, and like it turns out there was like MDMA on the water. So
no.
I think sacred geometry is kind of like that, because it's like, okay, do these like exercises, and you know, there's like all kinds of interesting exercises, like yeah, like visualize like the flower of life in your mind's eye, or like find the energy spots like right above your head, or like figure, you know, there's like fascinating stuff, and you experience that, is like, wow, I felt like I merged with the cosmos, or I felt the self-other divide broke down, and some release of energy. All those effects are real effects. You know, you're actually getting
You're
something.
actually having that experience, right?
You're having that experience. And is what we call valence effects. It's not like, you know, a dopaminergic pleasure like cocaine, but it is kind of this symmetrification and consonance of your experience. And from the point of view of QRI, what is going on there is that actually these are like neural annealing practices that are actually smoothing out the geometry of your experience and essentially improving the quality of it, the subjective quality of it. And the thing is that it works better if you assign a deep meaning to it. So the deep meaning...
You need to have the buy-in.
Yeah, you need to have the buy-in that helps the concentration. Now, I think like actually, you know, it's kind of like the stages. If you know it's kind of a trick, it might be difficult to replicate. Just as like if you don't believe in God, you know, church is not going to be as powerful. But then once you know the trick and you gather enough concentration, you can actually get the same effects without the
so even if you know the placebo effect is a placebo, you can still generate a placebo effect, essentially.
And essentially, it is the case that like not every shape will produce positive feelings. Like the flower of life will legitimately be a faster connection to a very blissful experience than, let's say, like a weird kind of like pinchy asymmetrical shape that is going to actually be kind of anxiogenic and unpleasant. And again, like from the...
It's like chaos versus like organization on some like real rough level.
Yeah. Well,
right.
In our account, essentially...
Or could you have like a beautiful geometry that's still anxiety inducing?
Well, it depends on... Like you could have a very symmetrical shape.
Okay.
That just does not correspond to the native symmetries of the mathematical...
So it's like it's either a neutral valence or maybe negative valence.
Could be negative, yeah. So it's more kind of like, in some sense... Okay, so here is a very important kind of like analogy. It's like, you know, like an ellipse, right? Like an ellipse, if you're kind of inside an elliptical room, you know, it's kind of like this big elliptical room. The walls are kind of an ellipse, and you're standing at one of the focal points, right?
Okay,
and you shout, you know, all of the waves will bounce off the room and converge on the other focal point. And from there, they will bounce off again and converge on you. Right?
Okay.
So there's like a special point, right? Like it's not arbitrary. If you do the same thing in other places, you're not going to get that effect. I think it's exactly the same. When you're focusing on some regions, usually along symmetrical axes of your consciousness, in some sense, you're directing energy by focusing your attention there. And from that is going to reflect into the outer edges of your experience. And if it's in the right places, it actually will bounce back and converge back. And that is going to generate a state of consonance. And in our theory, essentially, consonance is the source of positive valence. Whereas if you're actually using fixation points that are like in improper places, it will converge in a dissonant way and in out of phase, and that actually may generate suffering and states of displeasure. So it is that's why I make the analogy with it. Like, it is kind of like, yes, this is kind of like MDMA in a sacrament. In like, yes, you're actually doing exercises that are like fine-tuning your state of consciousness in a positive direction. But the story that they're giving you for why that is happening is just not the case. It has to do with like the physics of how the waves of attention are reflecting in your experience.
All right, so coming back to this model which we were working on in the previous interim break. So we have a sphere of consciousness, and we have distortions or some sort of folding, some sort of geometric pattern that is emerging in our sphere of awareness by paying attention to something. So when you pay attention to something, we can pull up a triangle, for example, from our previous break, where we imagine that triangle, and that is represented as a distortion within your field of awareness. So now what Andres is saying is that it appears that there are certain geometric patterns that if we impose these patterns into our attention, we imagine, we think of these different embodiments of different geometries, and by focusing and imagining these different patterns, we have a different subjective, qualitative experience that seems to come about from different types of imagination, different types of meditation on these different geometries. And so what Andres is suggesting here is that because you can imagine the flower of life or some other, hexagonal pattern which has some sort of sacred beauty to us, and in imagining that, you have this existential experience of being one with the cosmos, or having really focused awareness or a sense of peace, whatever that experience may be. He's making the argument that this is a reproducible phenomenon that people that undergo these different types of meditation can experience. I have not had this experience myself, so I'm only, commenting secondhand on his account of this. But essentially, because you can in a reproducible way experience these sort of altered, exalted, transcendental states of consciousness from particular geometries, but not from other geometries, this might lend some sort of insight into the nature of qualia, or the nature of human subjective experience. What is the model of consciousness, and can we learn something about this model from these geometries, right? So that's kind of the overall sentiment. What he's cautioning us against is this kind of class of New Age metaphysical theories where, because you can induce this sense of transcendental experience in people, let's just accept that you can reproducibly induce this in an individual. Now you're in a state of emotional receptivity where then I can unlay my metaphysics on you, and you're hyper receptive, kind of in this vulnerable, naive state of, wow, I had no idea that you could blow my mind so completely with this, mind-numbingly simple geometric shape, or this sort of mental rehearsal, this meditation, this imagination that you can induce in yourself. You have this profound valence, as Andres refers to this. This is his symmetry of valence theory, that there's certain symmetries that produce positive valence, positive emotional experiences. And because of this, it's kind of been leveraged into pushing different types of metaphysics. And he's cautioning us that just because you can have a strong, profound emotional experience doesn't mean you should buy into whatever metaphysical model that person is pushing on you. And for me, I think this is what's so refreshing about Andres as an intellectual, is that he's diving into a lot of these really new age topics, right? Various psychedelic experiences, sacred geometry, which has some sort of profound resonance with, I think, a lot of people. But what does this mean? Can we think rationally about these experiences and try to remove some of the sort of mystical thinking from this and try to ground this into science? And I fully acknowledge, and I think that this is a lot of new ideas that are not necessarily grounded in modern technology and in modern science. And we're still building that connecting bridge between the type of work that Andres is doing, really relying on people's subjective experiences, and then people doing neuroscience, people building computers, quantum computers. There's still a bridge that needs to be created here, but there is some reproducible subjectivity that is occurring in our culture and people. And I think we need to take this really critically. We need to think meaningfully and deeply about people's experiences subjectively. And Andres does a really great job of diving into these different experiences while trying to stay grounded. So hopefully that makes a lot of these ideas make more sense, and we'll hop back into the interview.
Yeah. There's this whole paradigm. I made a video about it. I also read up. It's my interpretation of like the kind of computing that the brain is doing is essentially this.
Yeah, because you mentioned neural annealing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this the topic you're about to go into?
It's very similar.
Okay.
So
you also want to get a definition of that when you get
absolutely.
a chance. Yeah.
So just high level view. There's there's a bunch of things I would say QRI is kind of contributing to the conversation, but like from the point of view of kind of like high level neuroscience and philosophy of mind. So we have like the symmetry theory of valence, which is like what aspects of experience correspond to a positive or negative, shade of qualia. We have neural annealing, which is essentially this dynamic physical account of things such as like why energizing your consciousness with psychedelics can actually be therapeutic, and when we get into like psilocybin for depression, that's very relevant. Yeah. Then we have like a paradigm of computation, which is like, how is your consciousness actually like computationally useful? I mean, this solves epiphenomenalism in our account, and we call it non-linear wave computing. So our brain is actually not a Turing machine, is not a classical computer, is nothing of that sort. It's using waves for computation. So when I say like,
I'm on board, of course.
Awesome. Yeah. Like
as a neural oscillations enthusiast.
Exactly. Yes. I'm very happy to dive into that. And then the last kind of big contribution is our solution to the binding problem. How is it possible that all of these different neurons can simultaneously contribute to a unified experience? From the classical kind of like ontology that people approach that question with is actually unsolvable. And I think people have actually known this for a while.
Yeah, you have to change like the units that you're working with to even have a solution. Like, come out in any capacity.
If the universe is made of like atoms and forces, it's impossible to solve because with special relativity, essentially you have that there's actually no objective like plane of simultaneity. There's like no way of actually saying like which neurons are firing at the same time. That's like essentially what you could call as like frame dependent. There's no matter of fact. So all the solutions in neuroscience of like, binding is just synchrony is like, actually that doesn't have a correct ontological grounding. There's no true thing as synchrony. It's all frame dependent.
So you're switching the frame to be a wave, which is inherently non-local.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
Rather than atoms and forces.
Inherently simultaneous.
Yes.
In a way.
You're inherently unified. So you need to shift to essentially an ontology where like the universe is a gigantic field of consciousness. And then it's not the binding problem, it's the boundary problem. And that can be solved with topology and bifurcations. Where essentially, if the universe is this gigantic field of consciousness, imagine like the surface of a balloon. You twist the balloon from both ends, and there's a precise moment where you get a pinch point. That's called a topological bifurcation. And then you actually get an objective boundary that divides the two sides of the field. And if that point actually, let's say, for example, reflects waves of energy, all of a sudden you get the native harmonics of the topological pocket, which means that the pocket can actually act as a unit. just as like, the sound of a guitar is actually a reflection of the entire shape of the guitar. So like making these topological segmentations have behavioral consequences. And that's why evolution actually cared about making, segmented minds because
so we're all in a big field. We're like pinching and like rolling off different units of consciousness, right?
Yes.
That's the model.
Yep. And with that, essentially, there is like an objective, precise amount of consciousness every moment of experience, which is like all the energy trapped in the topological pocket.
All right, I think this segment's a lot more straightforward, but I'll summarize it briefly. So the idea is that Andres is shifting our ontological, metaphysical view of reality to, instead of having a bunch of pieces that then need to build up a whole, we start from a wholeness of everything, a unified field of the universe as one potentially giant conscious experiencer, and then you're pinching off parts of that field into segmented topological segments, right? And the way that he kind of shows this is if you can imagine like the surface of a balloon, and you take a clump of that balloon and you twist it, you can actually roll it so that there's another sphere that's entirely separate from the whole. But it's still sort of linked in with the whole simultaneously, right? And so in his model, all conscious beings are still, stuck within or pinched off from the unified field of all things. However, we have our pinching, we have our bifurcation, our topological bifurcation, which creates a single self from the whole. And then he also imposes some sort of resonance or some sort of energy, some vibration that is occurring within these different fields. So there's potentially like a subfield within that topological segment. And then there's resonance patterns of that field, and the energy of consciousness or the intensity of consciousness would maybe be some sort of how dynamically that field is resonating. And now the bit that gets a little bit more complicated, which we'll get into in this next section, is that within the segmentation that is you, right, you're pinched off into this body, but there's also sub-segments within yourself which are also pinched. And so Andres will be talking about how there's sort of energy, or you could imagine there's just sort of dynamics flowing within these segments. And if you had a blockage or a sub-segment that's not resonating with the whole, then that could lead to further distortion. So maybe you view this as a sort of nested segmentation where you have segments within segments within segments. I guess we're in like some arbitrary geometric space, so we could potentially allow for infinite sub-segmentation within the field. So I think to me that would potentially be the best way to make sense of these ideas. Is there some sort of universal segment for you, then there's the universal field of all things, and then within your field there is some sort of segmenting where you can have pockets of energy which are doing their own thing, and then you have this more macro scale occurring. And what we will be going into is the connection of this to neural oscillations and electric fields in the brain, where, okay, we're speaking very abstractly about these geometric segments, but you can think about it a little more practically as maybe these are electrical resonance pockets within the brain, and then you can have more macroscopic electric resonance, and there's sort of this dynamic interaction between micro pockets and macro resonance structures, where if they're discordant with each other or they're not coherent with each other, then this might subjectively be experienced as some sort of negative affect, some sort of negative valence, Whereas if there is coherent resonance across these multiple different scales, then this is more of a positive valence experience. And I think a lot of this kind of resonates with my own theories about nested electric oscillations within the brain and sort of this fractal-like scaling of biological systems. So at face value, I appreciate these ideas and I can see a lot of value in this approach. I think the challenges here are if you want to make a hard topological segmentation, how do you have subsegments within this larger topology? Is there a distinction between a hard segmentation and maybe a soft segmentation where there's a stable sub-bifurcation which isn't as strongly disconnected as this larger scale, right? So what I'm trying to get at here is our sense of being a single person, of being a single individual, and then having blockages internally. I feel like you need at least two different types of bifurcation here, or some sort of nested bifurcation model. I don't know what Andres would think about this. These are ideas I'm having, in hindsight, but potentially we'll get this conversation started up again. There's this study that came out this week in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it shows that single dose psilocybin can have a pretty dramatic impact on mental health, particularly depression scores, and the effects seem to last a few weeks, and it kicks in more or less immediately, but then seems to have a resounding impact on people's lives. So I think this is definitely like the exciting new wave that psychiatry is moving in. So what is your research kind of informed us about that? What's the mechanism here?
So I'll start with the metaphor, which is in metallurgy. If you use a metal a lot, it's called a cold work. Essentially, tiny indentations in the metal will start to form, and essentially the crystal lattice that it had, which actually was what allowed it to have ductility and the properties that were very helpful for the material, it becomes imperfect. Essentially, it develops all of these pinch points and fault lines and indentations, and in a sense actually is like storing internal stress. And now if you heat it up above its recrystallization temperature, and there's going to be a threshold, if you don't heat it enough, it's not going to happen. Essentially, the lattice will start to reorganize, and at first it's in a chaotic way, but if you let it cool in a good schedule, it can actually cool into a perfectly symmetrical lattice.
Wow.
And it's one of these paradoxical things where you actually get more order
from the disorder, from
yes.
adding chaos. Yeah.
Of course, there's order in the cooling schedule, and that needs to be taken into account. And essentially, also introspect on what happens when you're really stressed. I mean, literally, and in the end, I think we will find out that actually
we're creating neural fault lines in our geometric neural fields or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one way of kind of quantifying how depressed or anxious you are is, and this is a QRI paradigm. It's kind of taking a lot of Eastern wisdom and hippie intuitions, but trying to formalize this. In meditation and yoga, they talk a lot about getting rid of blockages, for example. If you send a wave of awareness downwards and upwards, where does it get blocked, and where does it feel like it bounces off, or where does it refract or diffract? And essentially, the more of those, pinch point, shear points, imperfections, blockages, fault lines you have, the more unpleasant the experience is. Because the waves essentially will reflect and collide with each other and creating these moments of dissonance. And essentially, what is, for example, a state of anxiety? But a lot of very fast micro moments of dissonance and let's say strain and pressure. It's kind of you can tell, how anxious you are in terms of how much jittering of your attention there is, how much bottom up prediction errors are happening. It's my heart is doing these, all of that kind of paints a weird picture of what's going on in your body and your mind. We think also that will essentially follows a log normal distribution, in that, like, if you're like 9 out of 10 anxiety panic attack versus 5 out of 10, is like a huge.
It's like a huge exponential difference.
Yeah.
So you think one day we'll be able to, I don't know, map out neural resonance patterns, and we could actually detect the valence of someone's experience based on how coherently reflective the patterns are, the rhythms are, something like that.
Absolutely. Even with techniques like like how you can measure like reverb in a cave. You would do this like frequency sweep, like whoop, and you see like how it reflects back. Like doing things such as like stroboscopic stimulation of different frequencies.
Nice.
And seeing what are the neuroacoustics for that. Like if you're kind of messed up in some frequencies, you will see like, actually it reflects in this very poor way, misshaped way. Like it doesn't reflect all at once. It reflects faster here than here.
Or even like doing like magnetic impulses into someone's brain or something. That
exactly.
Cool. And even like taking like pinpoints and like expecting to see some like resonance pattern, and then it's there,
all of
but
that.
It's not there.
I mean, then it's gonna be kind of the question of like, what is the minimum viable like holistic assessment of the neuroacoustics of the person? A lot of food for that.
Oh my god. So then the annealing, back to the annealing. So then it's kind of like your metallurgy example,
Absolutely.
right? So you're trying to like heat up the brain, get a little more chaos, and then like recrystallize it into like a more coherent form.
In our theory, psychedelics, to a first approximation, I mean, and psychedelics do a lot of things, but like to a first approximation, they energize your state of consciousness.
I mean, for sure.
They do it in slightly different ways. We have this thing, it's called the tracer tool. I don't know if you've seen it. So we created this really cool tool. I could show you in my phone. Like, you should definitely put it on the.
I'll put it on there. Yeah. Okay.
Where essentially we have, it's kind of like a Photoshop for like simulating visual tracers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's not only kind of like like a decay function, but it's also like sometimes like you get kind of like this like frozen imagery on like LSD, or sometimes you have like what we call like replay effects, which is like the scene kind of like replays over and over, like every like 200 milliseconds or something. And it has like a decay function. So essentially or it shifts color. So our tool you can use to essentially put a video and then like fiddle with all the parameters until it looks like what it looked like on LSD or it looked like on DMT.
Amazing. So you're trying to map your experience into the video representation.
And and we put it online, and I shared it with like very trusted hardcore psychonauts, very rational hardcore like meditators and psychonauts, and essentially we got some preliminary data.
So they sent you back videos that they had edited or like tweaked these parameters.
Yeah, exactly. The tool is pretty cool because I mean you can use it online, and there's like a button to like submit parameters, and you just like
okay, so you just like submit some. Okay.
Yep. We have a spreadsheet where we're collecting the parameters from people online.
Interesting.
And there's like a preliminary data which I think is fascinating. It agrees with kind of like subjective reports, which is that phenethylamines make stroboscopic kind of like visual tracer effects between like 10 and 15 hertz. LSD is between like 15 and 20 hertz, like higher frequency. Psilocybin like around like 22 hertz. And then DMT is like 30 hertz, and 5-MeO is around like 40 hertz. So actually,
wow,
like
I mean that's bizarre. Yeah.
Well, and
I would love to get some like EEG or some recordings of that too. Right?
I mean, if you think like high gamma coherence, I think like that, probably tracks like something like 30 hertz stroboscopic stimulation or stroboscopic like tracers. And I mean, essentially, the theory here at a neurophysiological level is that there's like this serotonin receptor specific metronomes that are kind of like part of the visual control system that add things such as like reverb and echoes and strobes and things like that usually are used for things such as like being able to sync up audio and the visual experience, because you can add a little delay and like your brain knows how to account for that. So
you're viewing these ion channels as like pulsating, or they're setting some like rhythmic tone.
The thalamocortical loop essentially has like resonant modes, and there's like different depending on which serotonin receptor you're interacting with.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's more like activating activating different circuits that have the resonant tones. Okay,
Exactly.
cool.
Circuits that become the kind of like pattern generators. And essentially we view them as energy sources. So literally you take DMT and phenomenologically it feels like something is taking your experience and like shaking it like at 30 hertz.
Yeah.
And you experience these waves of energy like being emitted out of objects. Like it's crazy, right? Like if you actually, if you're not very sophisticated from a philosophical standpoint and you think you're seeing the world directly, you absolutely get the perspective that like, oh my gosh, like objects
the world's vibrating all around me. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. The world's repeating itself every 200 milliseconds.
Yeah. Whereas in this view is like, well, you're activating this metronome.
Yeah.
And that energizes your world simulation. And because your consciousness is actually using waves for computation, you actually get kind of like the waves colliding against each other. You get the energy minima of all of those patterns. And well, among those things, I mean, something that you can realize is that those waves all of a sudden can kind of like probe the blockages in your nervous system. So like if you have like a blockage or a stress point on DMT, the waves will be hitting it, and eventually it'll break through. It will break through, yeah. And so like, I would recommend, like, well, of course, like be very careful with psychedelics, but like that's why like equanimity and surrender is so important, because if you're resisting, you're actually adding extra pinch points and fault lines. Whereas like if you just let the energy flow, smooth it out, you will experience kind of like these sequences of breakthroughs where like, okay, you were experiencing a blockage here, but now all of a sudden the waves can go through. And then you can spend like, 10, 20 minutes with the waves going through without a problem. And that essentially becomes kind of a scaffold or kind of like a blueprint that, okay, you've had that energy flow. And when you come down, that's kind of like maybe with heavy unlearning or something like, okay, that pathway got activated. And now these parts of your nervous system that were not in speaking terms are actually all of a sudden able to speak with each other.
All right, so my camera actually shut off unexpectedly, so we lose the end of Andres' statement at this moment, unfortunately. But to really summarize this idea of neural annealing as it relates to psychedelic therapy. So what Andres is using as a metaphor is annealing, and this is also a metaphor used in quantum mechanics and quantum computers called quantum annealing. I cover this in a previous episode. But the idea here is that when you have a metal, there are tiny imperfections in the metal, and if you heat it up and then cool it again, this is the annealing process, you actually allow for this internal organizational structure to reassert itself. So metals have this sort of strong crystalline lattice that they form internally at a chemical level. And so through this heating process, you actually push out a lot of these imperfections and you allow for this more kind of raw, fundamental self-organizational principle to reassert itself into the macroscopic object once again. So the idea here is if you have a bunch of sub-segments, topological pockets within yourself, and maybe they're discordant, they're not resonant, by adding a psychedelic into the mind, into the brain, into the body, the theory here is that you're sort of heating up the brain and the body, but on sort of an energetic, cognitive, qualia, geometric level, right? So if there's some sort of an inherent resonant lattice geometric structure to the mind, can you heat up the mind and then allow it to recool into a more sustainable, stable structure, right? So the idea is that after having this psychedelic experience, where everything's very resonant and coherent, blissful, potentially high positive valence, once you return to the ground state, to the cooled, low energy state, have you restabilize yourself having more of these resonant structures persisting beyond that experience, right? You've sort of reorganized. You are an imperfect metal, and you've reasserted your natural crystalline alignment within your metallic self, right? To push this annealing metaphor to its ultimate end. And I think it's an interesting theory, right? I think the challenge here is we're speaking very abstractly. And so the question is, what does this really mean for biology, and how would we instantiate something like this, right? So if we think about electric oscillations, neural oscillations in the brain, could it be that psychedelics are boosting internal coherence that's going to this more macroscopic scale where many brain structures are coming into coherent electrical alignment, and that's sort of creating synaptic, stable, plastic changes in the brain, where now, after you've cooled down from the psychedelic experience, you have neural pathways that you can re-access to engage those same qualitative subjective experiences without needing so much energy to kind of break through those energy barriers. You've now created stable, simple, low energy pathways that have higher coherence than when you started, right? So that would be sort of a theory on why a single dose acute psychedelic experience could be therapeutic when in this sort of medical setting with the proper build-up and framing within, the therapeutic setting. So more on this to come.
I mean, from our theories and accounts, I think it's fairly likely that we will find that the total amount of consciousness that you're experiencing maps onto essentially the total energy that is in the patchwork of local field potentials of your brain.
Okay.
Obviously completely testable.
Yeah.
Which would suggest that when you take a psychedelic and you have more intense consciousness, that would mean that actually there is literally more energy in your patchwork of local field potentials. Like
higher amplitude.
Yeah.
Electrical fluctuations across the brain.
Yes, and more of them at once. And potentially some kind of large-scale grid pattern that interconnects all of the local field potentials, which increases the impedance matching between them and allows them to actually synchronize and enter into coherence. So
that would be awesome. I mean, yeah. So I think one of the challenges here, right, is we would love to get invasive recordings in people that are able to really manipulate their cognitive state in these dramatic ways.
Yes.
Because this feels beyond animal research, right? Yeah. I mean, maybe you could have focused attention in an animal where you're able to record at all these places, but yeah, it seems like that might not even get at this level.
Probably not. We might be a few years out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so, I mean, yeah, and that does seem really tractable. I mean, so a lot of my own work, I've been really interested in these big low-frequency electrical fluctuations in the brain, and particularly prefrontal seems to be a major generator of these low-frequency waves, and it gets they get transmitted across the brain.
Yeah.
And then you find coupling between these low-frequency more macro scale signals with these more localized higher frequency signals that are distributed into different regions. I don't know. And then just kind of on the same kick, just to hear your comments on this, it seems when you measure scalp electrical activity, you see such robust large scale rhythms.
Yeah.
And then when you go measure individual brain regions, you're almost in this other world electrically, where you're so zoomed in. And the activity patterns, I don't know, may or may not map up with these more global rhythms. So I mean, I wonder if you're in one of these transcendent states or these altered states with increased resonance, maybe you would see more of a correspondence between the global electrical field and the more local electrical fields. Yeah,
I would expect that. I mean, especially let's say the upper jhanas, becoming one with space, becoming pure consciousness. Things like that, from our point of view, from QRI's models, entail that there's essentially a dissolution of internal boundaries, meaning that whatever the patchwork of local field potentials is, you don't have like out of phase interactions between neighboring regions, meaning that yes, you will have like some kind of a super coherent grid pattern across the brain. And I mean, even more crazy is like on something like DMT. You know, I have this whole account of like the mathematical structure of each of the levels and so on. That especially on higher doses, you will have a patchwork of local field potentials that not only is it like hyper coherent across the brain, but it's so energized that its geometry is actually hyperbolic, and you actually inhabit a different phenomenal space, and that would be encoded in the geometry of those local field potentials. So, I mean, an example is I wrote this article about like emulating, you know, making a little pendant or really cool art installation that like essentially looks like hyperbolic 3D space. This uses like gradient index optics, where essentially you have two materials with different index of refraction that you blend in a smooth way. And when you do that, a beam of light, rather than kind of like sharply taking a turn as it happens, it goes through kind of this like curved path.
Wow. Okay.
So in principle, if you do essentially kind of like something like that, where like there's like a center of a certain index of refraction, it slowly turns into a different index of refraction, and then you cut it to make a dodecahedron, and you add kind of double, you know, or single-sided mirrors. From the point of view of light, it's gonna be in a hyperbolic space, and like the light rays, they're not gonna be able to tell that actually they inhabit an object that is embedded in 3D Euclidean space. But it's like from the point of view of the light rays, it's in a different geometry. I think it's gonna be the same with
the electrical waves in your brain.
Yes.
Yeah, because they're not actually in hyperbolic geometric space, but then the way that they're moving embodies like hyperbolic movement rather than Euclidean movement.
Absolutely. That's what
that'd be wild. That'd be super measurable, right? You could get in there and start just tracking electric field patterns.
And this is the kind of example of extremely wild and speculative things that QRI says that like may pay off like in 5 years. Is like, oh gosh,
we were wrong. We measured it,
totally
and that's good though. I mean, it's like it takes a lot to stick your neck out and have like a falsifiable theory. All right, so this is a really cool idea, in my opinion, of what Andres is really pitching here. And I covered this a bit in episode 31, so go check out that episode to learn a little bit more. But the basic idea here is that there are geometric properties to our experience, and these properties are most apparently distorted in psychedelics. And so Andres has spent some time mapping out the different geometric properties of different psychedelic states, and he basically makes the claim that while it seems like, oh my god, there's so much wild stuff going on visually, all this wild imagery, it seems like impossible shapes are being witnessed, these impossible shapes actually have clear geometric properties, but they're often what's called hyperbolic geometry. And hyperbolic geometry is, instead of Euclidean geometry, which is right angles, parallel lines that don't intersect, it's sort of that simple Euclidean Cartesian idea of what we think about kind of naively, intuitively for how the world around us is organized spatially. In hyperbolic geometry, everything is splitting off sort of constantly. So everything is curving, and there's sort of more space within a single location, right? So you could have 5 right angles that are all touching, whereas normally, you could only have 4 squares touching each other. In hyperbolic geometry, you can have more than 4 squares touching in a corner because space is fundamentally curving outward. And so this gives a lot of these sort of trippy feelings to when you're seeing geometry. It looks like everything's kind of folding and moving and undulating, and it kind of has a psychedelic property to it inherently. And so what Andres is saying is that if your mind space is instantiated in some physical property in the brain, if that physical property in the brain is moving or expressing itself in a hyperbolic pattern, then the internal experience might mirror some sort of hypergeometric experience, right? So the idea is that, yes, we're grounded within a simple Euclidean 3D reality, but if your mind is sort of being simulated from within the electrical activity of the brain, if the electrical activity of the brain is moving and changing according to hyperbolic geometric principles, then the internal experience of you embedded within that electric pattern, you would have a hyperbolic geometric experience. And so, this is potentially testable if you could get subjective reports and measurable data showing that when this activity pattern moves within a certain geometric distribution, the subjective experience fits with that geometric distribution. Potentially, this would be somewhat compelling evidence. Or, better yet, you could drive or you could change the electrical activity within the brain and force it to move hyperbolically. Could you induce a subjective experience of this sort of hyperbolic geometric scaling? So I do think, right now this stuff feels very much either beyond science or kind of in future science territory. But there are sort of testable experiments that you could potentially come up with to test these ideas. So I think this is really cool stuff, really exciting. Happy to hear what you all think about this out there.
It's probably not a good branding because it sounds like we're intolerant.
It sounds like you're intolerant. Yeah.
But no, this is like an anti-drug tolerance. So we have a zero tolerance policy. No, I'm joking.
For drug tolerance.
For drug tolerance. That's right. So, we're just like very pragmatic here in like, I think, opioids are like a bad idea for a lot of people. I don't think they're
you've commented on this on your channel.
Yeah, it's like I wouldn't recommend somebody taking morphine for fun because it's kind of too risky. They may get addicted. But if you have like severe chronic pain, untractable chronic pain, that like let's say a psychedelic experience or something is not going to help, or equanimity is not going to help, and like it's a sizable percent of the population. There's like about 5-7% with severe chronic pain. They need opioids, and like I'm very upset with kind of like the ideology of like no, like like the opioid epidemic is caused by overprescription of opioid medicine. That doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah.
And like that ideology has led to these like massive ethical disaster where essentially
you cut people off from their medications.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I've heard
and they
of
say
these
like
stories. Yeah.
Take ibuprofen instead or something like that, which is like actually may even have like worse side effects, but it just doesn't tackle the pain. And well, opioids don't work indefinitely. For some people they do, but like some people develop hyperalgesia. They don't work as well after a while. They make you feel loopy. But then we have like these crazy like case reports of people taking like very tiny doses of ibogaine as an example. Not the trip, not to have a psychedelic experience.
Oh, okay. But just like subthreshold levels.
Subthreshold levels that like seem to upregulate opioid receptors. And people, let's say somebody has taken like morphine for 20 years for chronic pain, severe chronic pain, and they start taking these micro doses of ibogaine. And like after 10 days or something, they're able to cut down their opioid dose by like 90%. And they actually get more pain relief. They're more clear-headed. They're like more motivated. They're like not depressed anymore. And like I don't really see like the problem there, but that's like criminally understudied essentially.
Yeah.
And ibogaine is just one example. There's like
is it, you think that's because the history around psychedelics and ibogaine being a psychedelic?
That is part of it.
Is that the rationale?
And I think, but part of it is, this sounds strange. Kind of like this is one of the strange places of intersection of QRI, which is like most psychedelic kind of like ideology is fairly opioid phobic, in that like they will they will say something like ibogaine is great for like junkies, getting people off of opioids, or they will say something like it's like for you to learn that you were betraying your family or something like that by being an addict or something like that. Whereas like we are radically pragmatic. It's like, no, there's some people who just need it.
Yeah.
Even, you know, I think like even within, if you're like spiritual and like in Buddhism, there's like even, like stories, like the Buddha had like actually like chronic pain, and like he sometimes would have like his disciple like give part of the lecture because he had like such a bad, you know, back pain. And, and or for example, like Daniel Ingram, who's like a fourth path, like, you know, enlightened person, he can break a bone and be fine. Like he's not going to suffer from broken bone, even though it's like very painful. But whenever he has a kidney stone, the pain is actually just so bad that despite his enlightenment, he still suffers.
He just can't even get through it.
No.
Yeah.
So there's pain so great that it doesn't matter what meditation technique you apply or how much equanimity you have, you will still suffer a great deal. And for that, we have opioids. And they work, right? So essentially, antitolerance drugs is this whole, we want to think of it not as a one-off thing, but as a field of study. Like,
so instead of upping your dosage of the medication, you're trying to up the receptivity to the medication in the brain.
And
interesting.
A very, very promising one in this area is quinolidine. Just like I'll make the quick plug. We will probably actually make a trial of this next year if we get the proper funding for it. But essentially, this is like super promising because it's like a completely new biochemical way of boosting endorphins. So if you flood the entire nervous system with opioids, essentially a lot of neurons that have nothing to do with like pain receptors, you know, become habituated to opioids. So like when you stop taking them, a lot of crazy things happen. You become sick, you know, nauseated, etc. So quinolidine, what it does is like it doesn't actually activate opioid receptors directly. What it does is like it disables this other receptor that is called ACKR3, which is a natural scavenger of endorphins. So essentially,
so you're boosting the body's like ability to collect up its own endorphins or something.
Exactly. And so you're not giving it endorphins, you're just kind of like making them last longer. And it's just going to be in the places where like naturally they're supposed to be. And at least, you know, from like early case reports, like there doesn't really seem to be any substantial tolerance to it or like withdrawal afterwards. I mean, we don't know for sure. And I'm not going to, you know, promise this is the case, but it's like, there's like some indications these might work. And, you know, it works for like mild pains, doesn't work for like severe pain, but it's also kind of like a very general mood booster and like motivation booster. And like, if these were to work, it could be like maybe like even better than coffee for everybody.
Totally. Yeah, I love that idea that you're kind of boosting the thing that is like regulating or kind of organizing these systems rather than like just cranking in like just the massive, you know, receptor floods.
Yeah, we call it like, you know, subtle drugs. At least in
subtle drugs,
that play with the brain's very own natural feedback system as opposed to like cranking it up in a harsh way, something like that.
Nice.
So
all right, Andres, well thanks for sitting with me. I'm sure we'll talk more in the future, and I appreciate your time, and sounds like you're doing so much cool research. I'd love to see where this institute goes, and I personally would love to see more nonprofits like this interested in research, and like, you know, we don't need to necessarily be in university systems per se, right? We could
it turns out
have new paradigms of financing stuff like this in the future maybe. So I'm totally on board.
And I look forward to continuing the conversation and seeing where the whole quantum consciousness paradigm goes. Very excited.
We didn't quite talk about quantum computers, but we'll save that for next time.
Fantastic. All right.
Alrighty.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. All right, so this is a series on quantum consciousness, and this episode doesn't quite have that much quantum consciousness, but I wanted to kind of end the episode thinking about these different models of geometry and how they might relate to quantum computers and to digital computers. So I take a little bit of a disagreement with Andres, where I do think that the brain is digitized on some level. And check out previous episodes, but the model coming from quantum mechanics is that the physical world is essentially a digitization of reality into particle form, into physical form. And so I think that the brain has a capacity for digitization and has sort of digital stores of memory. And we are potentially quantum computers interacting with a digital computational brain. And so when I think about Andres' ideas, I think there's a lot going on here, right? I think taking subjectivity seriously is really important. That's point one. I think, doing these sort of weird ways of trying to map out people's experiences geometrically is really important. But then I think we do need to go look in the brain. Where can we find these geometric patterns occurring? And maybe these patterns are occurring in places that we haven't yet looked, right? So I think one candidate is in the interference patterns of these wave functions of quantum computers. There's something inherently wave-like and non-local and distributed in the probability distributions that are the wave functions that govern the functioning of quantum computers. And this could be a candidate for expressing these types of unified field wave-like properties, but you might not even see that in the physical world per se. You might see the artifact of these geometric computations that are occurring in the digital physical world, but maybe a lot of this subjectivity, these qualia spaces, maybe these qualia spaces exist in the wave function, in the superposition domain. Another option, which I've talked about previously, is this idea of fractal computation, this idea of resonance across multiple scales within biology. I think there's new forms of computation out there that we have yet to discover. And so quantum computers are the advancement beyond the digital computer era. We're moving more fundamental. Digital computation is a subset, a subspace of quantum computation. But are there even more fundamental levels beyond the quantum computer? So if there's this unified field truly in the background of the universe, could this be very geometric in its nature? And quantum computers themselves are sort of these topological bifurcations of this background fractal-like field dimension of the universe. This is all potentially true. However, it is very speculative at this point. I think in my own life, I've kind of taken the practical steps of, I'm going to study brain stimulation and human neuroscience because these are the tools we have. I want to learn as much as I can about quantum computers, about digital computers. And I love, love, love these new ideas, these really creative thinkers like Andres, who's imagining maybe the next wave of understanding how wave functions are moving, or thinking about new properties of mathematics or new ways of defining mathematics that is even more fundamental. So we need these abstract thinkers, and we need the practical medical technologist as well. So I hope you enjoyed the discussion today, and I'll talk to you again real soon.